Imagine a quiet, unassuming stretch of desert west of Albuquerque, New Mexico, the West Mesa. The kind of place where the horizon stretches endlessly and the wind carries secrets that few ever hear. Now imagine that beneath this ordinary land lies a secret so dark it would shake an entire city and haunt investigators for years. Tonight, we tell the story of the West Mesa Bone Collector, a mystery of missing women, shallow graves, and unanswered questions. But be warned, the deeper we go, the more unsettling the truths become. By the end of this story, you may never see a quiet desert the same way again. Before we begin, if you enjoy detailed true crime stories delivered with a calm, immersive narration, consider subscribing, hitting like, and turning on notifications. This ensures that every future story drifts into your ears, night after night. In February 2009, workers clearing land on the West Mesa made a horrifying discovery. At first, they assumed the bones belonged to animals, but soon, it became clear that these were human remains, buried in shallow graves and scattered across the desert floor. 11 women, all missing for years, were suddenly connected by the soil that had hidden their secrets. Each discovery raised more questions than answers. Who were these women? How had they vanished without a trace? And most chillingly, who had buried them here, hidden in plain sight, in a city bustling just miles away? To understand the scope of this mystery, we must step back. Albuquerque is New Mexico's largest city, vibrant and sprawling, but like many urban centers, it has shadows. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, several women disappeared. Some were young, some struggled with poverty or addiction, some had little family support. Their disappearances were reported, sometimes investigated, but many cases went cold. Years passed, and the women faded from public attention, until the desert revealed its secret. The West Mesa, a stretch of land covered in dirt and scrub, became the site of one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries in modern American crime history. Each shallow grave told a story. Each fragment of bone whispered of a life cut short. And beneath it all, one question lingered. Who could commit such acts, and why? Tonight, we begin unraveling that question. Stay with me as we explore the lives of these women, the timelines of their disappearances, and the investigation that followed, all leading to a mystery that remains unsolved. To understand the full weight of the West Mesa Bone Collector mystery, we must now turn our attention to the women whose lives were taken, one by one. These were not just names on a list. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, and in some cases, children themselves, each with a story, hopes, and people who loved them. What unites them in this tragic case is that all 11 of these women were discovered buried together on the West Mesa, their disappearances stretching across years before anyone knew their fate. The remains uncovered in 2009 were eventually identified as those of 11 women and girls who had gone missing between 2001 and 2005. They ranged in age from just 15 to 32 years old. The first name on this list is Monica Candelaria, 22 years old when she vanished in May 2003. To those who knew her, Monica was more than the difficulties she faced. Friends later told investigators that rumors had circulated early on about her possible murder and burial, but nothing was confirmed until the gravesite was found years later. Then there was Victoria Chavez, 26, when she disappeared in June 2003. Victoria was the first of the victims whose remains were positively identified after the excavation began. What her family remembers most is her free spirit and the life she once lived before she was lost to the streets of Albuquerque. Two of the youngest victims were Jamie Barella and Selania Edwards, both only 15 years old. Jamie's disappearance is especially heartbreaking because she was not known to be involved with drugs or sex work, unlike most of the other victims. She was last seen with her older cousin, Evelyn Salazar, who would also be found buried on the West Mesa. Selania, the only African-American victim in the group, came from Lawton, Oklahoma, and had run away from home, eventually ending up in New Mexico. Virginia Cloven, 24, was another young woman whose life was cut short. She had endured tragedy before, losing her brother to homicide, and her life had been marked by upheaval long before she disappeared. Several victims were in their mid-20s and early 30s when they vanished. Cinnamon Elks, 32, was friends with other women in the group, and those connections would later help investigators piece together parts of the puzzle. Doreen Marquez, 27, left behind 2 daughters. Her family later described how her struggles with addiction had driven her to the very edges of the life she once led. Julie Nieto, 24, was a devoted mother to a young son, remembered by relatives as someone who had tried to rebuild her life after traumatic experiences in her past. Veronica Romero, 28, was the mother of 5 children when she vanished. Her family never stopped waiting for her return, even as years went by without answers. Michelle Valdez, 22 and 4 months pregnant, was taken from the world just as she was about to become a mother once more. Her disappearance left a profound void in her family's life. These women came from different backgrounds, but their stories intersect in a way no one could have predicted when they first went missing. They remind us that behind every headline, every cold case, are real lives and real grief. Lives that deserve to be remembered, and justice that has yet to be served. As we move deeper into the West Mesa bone collector mystery, it's essential to build a clear timeline of when these disappearances began and how the investigation unfolded, piece by piece. This chronology not only anchors the story in real events, but reveals how long the truth lay hidden beneath the desert soil. The first known disappearance that would later be connected to the West Mesa site occurred in May 2003, when Monica Candelaria vanished from Albuquerque. Over the next 2 years, several other women would go missing under circumstances that, at the time, appeared unrelated. Victoria Chavez disappeared in June 2003, followed by Selania Edwards in August of the same year. Then came Doreen Marquez in October. Into 2004, additional names were added to the list. Veronica Romero in February, Jamie Barella and her cousin Evelyn Salazar in March, Virginia Cloven in April, Julie Nieto in July, Cinnamon Elks in August, and finally Michelle Valdez in September. All of these women would later be identified in the West Mesa graves. Between 2001 and 2005, at least 11 women disappeared from the Albuquerque area, most in their early 20s. They were young, vibrant, and in many cases vulnerable, with ties to drugs, sex work, or unstable living situations. Because of these circumstances, some of their disappearances initially did not receive sustained media attention or thorough investigative follow-up, a factor that would later hamper police efforts. By 2005, the last of the known victims had vanished. Satellite imagery from that period shows disturbed soil and tire marks in the desert near what would become the burial site, suggesting the graves were made before the area underwent residential development. But the story did not become public until the early months of 2009. On February 2nd, a woman walking her dog noticed something unusual jutting from the dry earth, what appeared to be a femur bone. She alerted authorities, and what began as a routine investigation quickly turned into something far darker. Within days, detectives uncovered not one set of remains, but multiple shallow graves scattered across the West Mesa. 11 women, all long reported missing, were found buried across a roughly 92-acre expanse. For law enforcement, the discovery marked the beginning of one of the largest and most chilling homicide investigations in Albuquerque's history. Detectives from the Albuquerque Police Department and forensic teams spent months carefully excavating the site. Each set of bones was meticulously documented, cataloged, and compared to missing persons reports. Families who had feared the worst were finally able to confirm their daughters' fates, though justice remained elusive. Investigators quickly concluded that the victims were likely the work of a single killer, a predator who may have targeted vulnerable women, possibly by gaining their trust before taking their lives. Law enforcement dubbed the unknown perpetrator the West Mesa Bone Collector. Yet despite the magnitude of the crime, no arrests were ever made. Suspects emerged, theories circulated, and leads were pursued, but none led to a definitive conviction. Over the following years, the case would see countless tips, additional searches of the surrounding land, and even renewed interest from the public and media. Yet to this day, the identity of the person or persons responsible remains unknown, and the community continues to grapple with why so many vanished without a trace. Until The discovery of the West Mesa graves was only the beginning. Once the bodies were uncovered, law enforcement faced the enormous task of piecing together who was responsible, how the crimes were carried out, and why these women had vanished without warning. But this investigation proved to be far from straightforward. From the start, one of the biggest challenges was the lack of witnesses. Many of the women had struggled with poverty, addiction, or involvement in sex work. These circumstances made it difficult for authorities to track their last known movements or establish consistent leads. Families often provided fragmented information, and in several cases, the women had been estranged from loved ones for months or even years before disappearing. Investigators also had to contend with the desert environment itself. The West Mesa is vast, isolated, and largely undeveloped. Shallow graves could be easily disturbed over time, and heavy machinery or natural erosion may have altered the scene. Forensic teams meticulously documented each grave, measuring depth, position, and the surrounding soil, hoping to find clues that might indicate the sequence of burials or the methods used by the perpetrator. In terms of suspects, several individuals were investigated over the years, but none led to conclusive evidence. One of the most discussed leads involved local men who were known to frequent areas where vulnerable women gathered. Some of these individuals had histories of violent crime, but investigators could not definitively connect them to the West Mesa murders. DNA and other forensic evidence were either insufficient or contaminated by the passage of time, leaving key questions unanswered. The scale of the crime suggested a methodical offender. 11 women, buried over several years in a single area, pointed to someone who was familiar with the terrain and confident in avoiding detection. Yet, despite numerous interviews and searches, police could not identify a single suspect with certainty. Public involvement played a significant role in the investigation. Families of the victims, journalists, and concerned citizens provided tips and information that sometimes led to new discoveries, including the identification of remains. Social workers and advocacy groups highlighted the vulnerabilities of at-risk women, emphasizing the need for communities to pay closer attention to missing persons reports, especially those involving marginalized individuals. The media coverage of the case also shaped the investigation. While the discovery of the graves made national headlines, details were often scarce due to the sensitivity of the victims' lives and the ongoing nature of the investigation. This careful reporting helped protect evidence but also frustrated families desperate for answers. Despite the challenges, law enforcement never closed the case. The Albuquerque Police Department continues to maintain a dedicated file on the West Mesa murders. Advances in forensic technology, including DNA analysis and genealogical tracing, offer hope that one day the perpetrator may be identified. Until then, the West Mesa bone collector remains an unknown figure, a haunting presence behind one of the most chilling unsolved cases in New Mexico's history. The complexity of this case, the gaps in evidence, and the difficulties in tracking suspects underscore the tragic reality. 11 women lost their lives, and the mystery of who took them remains unresolved. The discovery of the West Mesa graves was only the beginning. Once the bodies were uncovered, law enforcement faced the enormous task of piecing together who was responsible, how the crimes were carried out, and why these women had vanished without warning. But this investigation proved to be far from straightforward. From the start, one of the biggest challenges was the lack of witnesses. Many of the women had struggled with poverty, addiction, or involvement in sex work. These circumstances made it difficult for authorities to track their last known movements or establish consistent leads. Families often provided fragmented information, and in several cases, the women had been estranged from loved ones for months or even years before disappearing. Investigators also had to contend with the desert environment itself. The West Mesa is vast, isolated, and largely undeveloped. Shallow graves could be easily disturbed over time, and heavy machinery or natural erosion may have altered the scene. Forensic teams meticulously documented each grave, measuring depth, position, and the surrounding soil, hoping to find clues that might indicate the sequence of burials or the methods used by the perpetrator. In terms of suspects, several individuals were investigated over the years, but none led to conclusive evidence. One of the most discussed leads involved local men who were known to frequent areas where vulnerable women gathered. Some of these individuals had histories of violent crime, but investigators could not definitively connect them to the West Mesa murders. DNA and other forensic evidence were either insufficient or contaminated by the passage of time, leaving key questions unanswered. The scale of the crime suggested a methodical offender. 11 women, buried over several years in a single area, pointed to someone who was familiar with the terrain and confident in avoiding detection. Yet, despite numerous interviews and searches, police could not identify a single suspect with certainty. Public involvement played a significant role in the investigation. Families of the victims, journalists, and concerned citizens provided tips and information that sometimes led to new discoveries, including the identification of remains. Social workers and advocacy groups highlighted the vulnerabilities of at-risk women, emphasizing the need for communities to pay closer attention to missing persons reports, especially those involving marginalized individuals. The media coverage of the case also shaped the investigation. While the discovery of the graves made national headlines, details were often scarce due to the sensitivity of the victims' lives and the ongoing nature of the investigation. This careful reporting helped protect evidence but also frustrated families desperate for answers. Despite the challenges, law enforcement never closed the case. The Albuquerque Police Department continues to maintain a dedicated file on the West Mesa murders. Advances in forensic technology, including DNA analysis and genealogical tracing, offer hope that one day the perpetrator may be identified. Until then, the West Mesa bone collector remains an unknown figure, a haunting presence behind one of the most chilling unsolved cases in New Mexico's history. The complexity of this case, the gaps in evidence, and the difficulties in tracking suspects underscore the tragic reality. 11 women lost their lives, and the mystery of who took them remains unresolved. The discovery of the West Mesa graves did more than shock Albuquerque. It left a lasting mark on the community and the families of the victims. For years, families had lived with uncertainty, hoping that their loved ones might return. When the graves were uncovered in 2009, they were finally confronted with the painful reality. The women they had been searching for were gone, and their lives had been violently ended. For the families, closure came in the form of identification, but justice remained elusive. Many expressed feelings of anger, grief, and frustration. Parents and siblings had spent years filing missing person reports, attending vigils, and searching for answers. Some had feared the worst long before the bodies were discovered. When the truth emerged, the relief of knowing what had happened was intertwined with the sorrow of knowing justice had not been served. The impact on the community was also profound. Albuquerque, a city already familiar with struggles related to crime, poverty, and addiction, faced a collective reckoning. Questions arose about how vulnerable individuals, particularly women involved in sex work or battling addiction, could disappear without triggering sustained attention from authorities. The West Mesa murders highlighted systemic issues, from under-resourced investigations to societal neglect, sparking conversations about how communities can protect those at risk. Local advocacy groups stepped forward in response. Organizations dedicated to supporting families of missing persons and preventing violence against women gained increased visibility. They provided resources, raised awareness, and encouraged vigilance in neighborhoods, emphasizing that missing women's cases should never be ignored. These groups also worked to ensure that the West Mesa victims would be remembered not only as numbers in a case file, but as real people with full lives, dreams, and families who loved them. The media played a dual role. While coverage of the West Mesa murders brought attention to the victims, it also confronted the public with unsettling realities about crime and social vulnerability. Documentaries, news articles, and later podcasts helped keep the case in public awareness, ensuring that it would not fade from memory. Yet, even with media attention, the elusive identity of the bone collector remained a chilling reminder that some criminals can evade capture indefinitely. The legacy of the West Mesa case endures today. Memorials have been established, and families continue to honor the lives of the women who were lost. Some continue to advocate for improvements in law enforcement practices and community safety, hoping that their efforts may prevent similar tragedies in the future. Above all, the West Mesa bone collector case is a reminder of the human cost behind crime statistics. Each victim represents a life interrupted, a family forever changed, and a community forced to confront its vulnerabilities. While the desert eventually gave up its secret, it also left a permanent scar, a haunting testament to the women who were taken too soon and to the enduring mystery of the person who committed these crimes. In remembering the victims, we are reminded that justice is not only about convictions, but also about acknowledgement, remembrance, and vigilance. A commitment to ensuring that the lives lost are never forgotten. Even more than a decade after the West Mesa graves were discovered, the identity of the person responsible remains unknown. Despite extensive investigation, the case of the West Mesa bone collector is still officially unsolved, leaving families, law enforcement, and the Albuquerque community searching for answers. Law enforcement continues to monitor leads and review evidence as new forensic technologies become available. DNA analysis has advanced significantly since 2009, and cold cases across the country have been reopened thanks to genealogical databases and sophisticated crime scene reconstruction techniques. In the West Mesa case, investigators have re-examined bone fragments, personal effects, and other trace evidence in the hope that one day, a match will emerge. While no definitive breakthrough has occurred, these modern tools keep the case alive, offering a glimmer of hope for eventual resolution. Several theories have emerged regarding the perpetrator. One theory suggests a single, methodical killer with detailed knowledge of the West Mesa terrain. The careful burial of 11 women over several years indicates planning, patience, and the ability to operate undetected. Some experts have speculated that the perpetrator may have been connected to the local sex work or drug community, as many victims had vulnerabilities in common, which could have made them easier targets. Another possibility considered by investigators is that there was more than one individual involved. The logistics of burying multiple women in an isolated area over several years suggest that assistance, or at least knowledge of the graves, may have been necessary. Yet, no concrete evidence has ever confirmed the involvement of multiple perpetrators. Families of the victims have also offered insights. Many have shared suspicions about acquaintances or former partners of the women who disappeared. While some of these individuals were investigated at the time, none were definitively linked to the graves. Family testimony has been invaluable, not only in identifying the remains but also in providing context about the women's lives, routines, and relationships, which continue to inform investigators' efforts. Media coverage and public interest have played a critical role in keeping the investigation alive. True crime journalists, podcasts, and documentaries have examined the case in depth, reviewing available evidence, timelines, and interviews. This public scrutiny has generated tips and occasionally prompted law enforcement to revisit leads, demonstrating the power of persistent attention in unsolved cases. Despite the lack of a known perpetrator, the West Mesa bone collector case has had a profound impact on law enforcement protocols and public awareness. The tragedy highlighted the importance of taking missing persons reports seriously, particularly those involving vulnerable populations. It also underscored the need for cooperation between families, investigators, and forensic specialists to solve complex, long-term cases. For now, the West Mesa bone collector remains a haunting mystery. 11 women lost their lives, their stories etched into the desert soil, and justice remains out of reach. Yet each day, investigators, families, and communities remain vigilant. Advances in forensic science, renewed investigative energy, and public awareness may one day reveal the truth, bringing closure to the families and answering the questions that have lingered for so long. The mystery endures, a reminder that even in a quiet desert, some secrets lie buried, waiting for the world to uncover them. As we reach the final part of our journey into the West Mesa bone collector case, it is important to reflect on the lives lost, the unanswered questions, and the lessons this tragedy leaves behind. While much of the mystery remains unresolved, the stories of the 11 women and the perseverance of their families ensure that their lives are not forgotten. Each of the victims had a life full of complexity, dreams, and relationships. They were daughters, sisters, friends, and in some cases, mothers. Their disappearances remind us that behind every headline lies real human experience. People who mattered to someone, who had hopes, and who deserved safety and care. By recounting their stories, we honor them, and we preserve their memories against the fading of time. The West Mesa case also serves as a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities faced by certain members of society. Addiction, poverty, and social marginalization made these women more susceptible to predation. Communities and law enforcement agencies have since recognized the need for better resources, support systems, and vigilance to prevent similar tragedies. Awareness campaigns and advocacy groups have emerged, aiming to shine light on the risks faced by vulnerable populations, ensuring that missing person reports are treated seriously and consistently. From an investigative standpoint, the West Mesa murders highlight both the challenges and advancements in forensic science. The meticulous excavation, identification, and cataloging of remains were remarkable feats in themselves. Yet the case demonstrates the difficulty of solving crimes where evidence is limited and time has passed. The ongoing potential of DNA technology and genealogical tracing offers hope, proving that even cold cases can find answers when science and persistence intersect. For the families, the grief continues, but so does resilience. Many have transformed their tragedy into action, advocating for better protections, raising public awareness, and supporting others in similar situations. Their courage is a testament to the enduring human spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, people can find ways to make meaning and seek justice. As we conclude, consider the lessons of the West Mesa bone collector case. It teaches us vigilance, empathy, and the importance of remembering those who may not always be heard. It reminds us that even in quiet, isolated places, like the stretches of desert west of Albuquerque, profound human stories unfold, sometimes hidden for years, waiting for attention, care, and justice. Although the perpetrator remains unknown, the legacy of the West Mesa victims is secure. Through storytelling, remembrance, and continued investigation, their lives are honored, and their stories continue to influence communities, law enforcement, and advocates across the country. In remembering the West Mesa bone collector case, we honor not only the victims but also the tireless efforts of those seeking answers. And while the desert may have hidden these secrets for years, their stories now live with us. A caution, a remembrance, and a call to never forget the human lives behind every crime. The mystery endures, but so does hope. Hope that one day, justice will be served, and that the stories of these 11 women will finally find the resolution they deserve. Story 2. Imagine a quiet, small town in the heart of Iowa, the kind of place where everyone knows each other, where front porches welcome warm summer evenings and children play in the streets without worry. It is Villisca, Iowa, in the year 1912. On the surface, life seems ordinary, peaceful even. But beneath the calm, a darkness is about to emerge that will haunt this town for generations. Tonight, we recount the story of the Villisca Axe murders, a shocking and brutal crime that took the lives of an entire family and 2 visiting children, leaving a community reeling and a mystery that remains unsolved more than a century later. This is not just a story of tragedy. It is a story of intrigue, suspicion, and questions that linger to this day. Before we begin, if you enjoy detailed, calm narrations of real crimes designed to be both engaging and sleep-friendly, consider subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications. Each new story is designed to drift into your evening, taking you through mysteries and histories while offering a sense of calm immersion. The story begins on the night of June 9, 1912. The Moore family, Josiah and Sarah Moore and their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, were preparing for bed as the summer evening settled over Villisca. The family had welcomed 2 young visiting girls, Ina and Lena Stillinger, who were spending the night in the Moore home. Across town, neighbors went about their routines, unaware that within hours, a terrible crime would unfold that would shock the state of Iowa. What made the case so chilling was not only the brutality of the murders, but also the complete lack of immediate explanation. Every member of the Moore family and their young guests would be found murdered in their beds, bludgeoned by an axe in a scene of unimaginable horror. The weapon, left behind at the scene, hinted at sudden violence, but the reason, the identity of the killer, and the motive all remained hidden. As investigators arrived the following morning, the quiet town of Villisca became a focal point for headlines across the country. Speculation ran rampant. Who could commit such an act in a small, trusting community? Was it someone they knew, or a stranger who had entered their lives unnoticed? Each lead seemed to dissolve into uncertainty, each clue raising new questions. The Villisca axe murders are more than a historical crime. They are a window into early 20th century America, a time when small towns faced both the charm of close-knit communities and the vulnerabilities that came with isolation and trust. Over the next sections, we will explore the lives of the Moore family, the details of that fateful night, the investigation that followed, and the many theories that continue to intrigue both historians and true crime enthusiasts today. Stay with me as we step back into 1912, into the streets of Villisca, into the Moore home, and into a mystery that will keep you engaged until the very end. To understand the gravity of the Villisca axe murders, we must first meet the family at the center of the tragedy. Josiah Moore, a 43-year-old successful businessman, was well known and respected in Villisca. He owned a local hardware store and was considered a man of integrity and routine, someone whose presence was familiar in the quiet streets of the town. His wife, Sarah Moore, 39, was a devoted mother, managing the household and caring for their 4 children with steadfast dedication. Together, they embodied the stability and charm of small-town life. Their children were bright, lively, and full of promise. Herman Moore, 11, was the oldest, responsible and curious, often helping his father at the store or playing outdoors with neighborhood friends. Catherine Moore, 10, was imaginative and kind-hearted, while Boyd Moore, 7, and Paul Moore, 5, were energetic, playful, and inseparable in their mischief. The family dynamic was warm and loving, a snapshot of life in a safe, welcoming Iowa town. On the night of the murders, the Moore family had also opened their home to 2 young friends, Ina and Lena Stillinger, daughters of a family friend. The girls, 8 and 12 years old, were spending the night in a gesture of friendship, unaware that the night would turn fatal. This decision, innocent and ordinary, would ultimately make them part of a horror that would shock the nation. The Moore family's home, a modest yet comfortable 2-story residence, reflected the simplicity and order of their lives. Bedrooms were carefully maintained, meals were regularly prepared, and the rhythm of life followed familiar routines. It is within these ordinary surroundings that the extraordinary horror unfolded, a stark contrast between daily life and sudden, violent tragedy. Each member of the family and the visiting children shared a common vulnerability. They were asleep, unaware, and unsuspecting. This would make them completely defenseless against the person who entered their home that night. The lives of 6 children and 2 adults, as well as the 2 visiting girls, were brutally ended in a manner that would leave investigators searching for motives and leads for decades. While much of what we know comes from reports compiled in the days following the murders, historians and true crime researchers have meticulously pieced together the personalities, habits, and routines of the Moore family. Understanding who they were is essential, for it allows us to appreciate the full scale of the tragedy. These were ordinary people with dreams and hopes, whose lives were taken abruptly and violently. Their story reminds us that true crime is not just about the act itself, but about the people whose lives were forever altered, and the families and communities left behind to grapple with loss, fear, and unanswered questions. The night of June 9, 1912, began like any other in Villisca, Iowa. Summer had settled over the small town, and the Moore household followed its usual evening routine. Josiah and Sarah Moore completed their daily chores, ensured their children were settled for bed, and perhaps readied themselves for a quiet night of rest. The visiting girls, Ina and Lena Stillinger, were asleep in the home, unaware of the violence that was approaching. At some point during the night, a figure entered the Moore home. Details about the intruder remain unclear, as no one witnessed the events firsthand. What is known is chilling. The assailant moved through the house with calculated efficiency, targeting the sleeping family members and the visiting children with a blunt axe, striking with fatal precision. The brutality of the murders shocked even investigators who were accustomed to violent crime. Each victim, from the youngest child to the parents, was struck while asleep, leaving no opportunity to resist or escape. The following morning, the quiet streets of Villisca were disrupted by an unusual stillness around the Moore residence. Neighbors, concerned by the absence of activity, approached the home. When they entered or peered inside, they were confronted with a scene of unimaginable horror. All 6 members of the Moore family and the 2 visiting girls lay dead in their beds, the result of repeated violent blows. The house, once a place of warmth and life, had become a chamber of tragedy. Word spread quickly through Villisca, and soon authorities arrived at the scene. Sheriff Charlie Moore and local deputies conducted an initial assessment, realizing that the crime was not only brutal but methodical. The perpetrator had entered and exited the home without leaving clear traces of their identity. Footprints, fingerprints, and other evidence provided limited clues, leaving investigators with a haunting mystery. Residents of the town were in shock. Villisca, a community that prided itself on its tight-knit neighborhoods and safety, had experienced an event so violent that it seemed almost impossible in a place so ordinary. Families gathered, offering support and trying to comprehend how such an act could occur in the home of people they knew and trusted. The realization that the killer could have been a neighbor, someone familiar, added to the fear and uncertainty that gripped the town. The Moore home itself became a focal point for investigation. Every room, every piece of furniture, and every household item was examined for clues. Investigators noted the positions of the bodies, the locations of the acts, and subtle details that might indicate the perpetrator's method or motive. Yet despite meticulous examination, no clear suspect emerged immediately. By the end of that first day, Villisca had transformed. The small, quiet town was no longer just a peaceful community. It had become the center of one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in Iowa history. The deaths of the Moore family and the visiting children would haunt residents for years, sparking rumors, suspicion, and a relentless search for answers that continues to this day. The discovery of the Moore family murders immediately sparked one of the most intense investigations in Iowa's history. Authorities faced a crime scene that was brutal and perplexing, with few clues and a killer who had vanished without a trace. The sheer violence and apparent randomness of the act left both investigators and the community struggling to understand who could commit such a crime and why. Local law enforcement quickly organized searches, interviews, and evidence collection. Sheriff Charlie Moore, aided by deputies and volunteers, examined the home, the surrounding property, and nearby streets. Every detail was noted, from the positions of the bodies to the location of the murder weapon, a common household axe that had been left at the scene. Despite these efforts, the perpetrator's identity remained elusive. From the beginning, suspicion fell on people familiar to the Moore family. Small towns like Villisca often operate on trust and routine, and investigators considered neighbors, acquaintances, and local residents who might have had grievances or motives. Yet, despite questioning dozens of individuals, including family friends and business associates, no evidence definitively linked anyone to the murders. Several suspects were discussed publicly and privately over the years. One prominent theory involved a man who reportedly had been seen near the Moore home in the days leading up to the murders. Another involved a traveling minister with a reputation for eccentric behavior who had been in the area at the time. Investigators explored personal disputes, jealousies, and rumors, but each potential lead ultimately failed to produce conclusive proof. Early forensic methods were limited compared to modern standards. Investigators relied on observation, witness testimony, and the examination of physical evidence such as footprints and the blood-stained axe. Autopsies provided critical information about the time and nature of the deaths, confirming that the murders had occurred overnight while the victims slept. Despite careful documentation, the methods available in 1912 could not identify the killer definitively. Theories about motive varied. Some suggested revenge, either personal or professional, as Josiah Moore was a local businessman. Others considered the possibility of a random act of violence, carried out by someone with violent tendencies and knowledge of the household. Some believed the murders were the work of a transient criminal, passing through town and taking advantage of a quiet community. Others speculated that a disturbed individual, driven by darker impulses, had planned the killings with careful precision. The investigation also faced social and logistical challenges. Villisca, while a close-knit community, lacked the resources of a larger city. Communication was slower, records were limited, and the ability to track suspects over time was constrained. Despite these obstacles, authorities remained committed to solving the case, documenting evidence meticulously and following every potential lead. While no arrest was ever made, the investigation left a lasting record of both the crime and the community's determination. The Villisca Axe murders would become a symbol of early 20th century small-town tragedy, a case defined by unanswered questions, suspicion, and the haunting presence of a killer who disappeared into the night. The morning after the Moore family and their young guests were found, Villisca awoke to a town transformed. What had been a quiet, close-knit community now felt fragile and unsafe. Families locked doors that had always been open, neighbors cast wary glances at one another, and the sense of normalcy that had defined daily life was shattered. The brutality of the murders created an atmosphere of fear, suspicion, and grief that touched nearly every household. Residents struggled to comprehend how such violence could strike in a place where everyone knew each other. Questions swirled. Had the killer been a neighbor, someone they passed on the streets every day, or had a stranger arrived in town, leaving behind only chaos and tragedy? The uncertainty fueled anxiety, and the town became hyper-aware of strangers, minor disturbances, and anything unusual in the nights that followed. Media attention quickly amplified the fear and fascination. Newspapers from Iowa and beyond reported the murders in stark detail, capturing the shock and horror of a small-town massacre. Journalists described the scene in the Moore home, the lives of the victims, and the baffling lack of suspects. Stories spread across the nation, turning Villisca into a focal point for public curiosity, speculation, and horror. The coverage also highlighted societal vulnerabilities, drawing attention to the risks faced by women and children, even in seemingly safe environments. The press, while reporting on the tragedy, also helped preserve the memory of the victims. Articles detailed the Moore family's lives, their contributions to the town, and the love and hope that had characterized their home before the murders. Families of the victims found that these stories, while painful, offered a measure of acknowledgement, a way to ensure that their loved ones were not forgotten. In the weeks and months that followed, Villisca's residents sought ways to cope. Memorials and vigils were held, and discussions about community safety became central to town meetings. Churches and civic organizations provided spaces for reflection, mourning, and collective support. People worked together to restore a sense of security, but the shadow of that night lingered. The murders had left an indelible mark, influencing local culture, behavior, and the town's perception of safety for decades to come. Beyond the immediate emotional impact, the case influenced law enforcement practices and public awareness. It highlighted the need for careful evidence preservation, the importance of taking missing person reports seriously, and the challenges inherent in investigating crimes in small towns with limited resources. Over time, the story of Villisca served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even ordinary communities can face extraordinary violence. The Villisca Axe murders continue to resonate more than a century later. The town remains a place where the past is remembered, where families honor the Moore children and their parents, and where the story of that fateful night serves as both a tragedy and a lesson. The community's response, shaped by grief, resilience, and a desire for justice, remains an essential part of understanding this haunting chapter in American history. Despite the intensity of the investigation and the attention of law enforcement, the identity of the person who murdered the Moore family and the two visiting girls was never definitively established. Over the years, numerous suspects were considered, and countless theories emerged, yet none led to a conviction. The mystery endures, leaving a lingering question: who committed one of the most infamous unsolved murders in American history? One early suspect was a local man with a reputation for unusual behavior, who reportedly had been seen near the Moore home on the night of the murders. Investigators considered whether personal grievances or unresolved conflicts could have driven him to commit such violence. However, evidence tying him to the crime remained inconclusive, and he was eventually cleared, though public speculation persisted. Another theory involved a traveling minister, whose presence in Villisca around the time of the murders raised suspicion. Some accounts suggested he exhibited peculiar tendencies, and he became a figure of interest in the investigation. Despite extensive questioning and scrutiny, no physical or circumstantial evidence linked him to the crime, leaving only speculation about his possible involvement. The murders also prompted broader theories about motive. Some believed the killings were the result of personal revenge, possibly connected to Josiah Moore's business or social relationships. Others considered the possibility of a transient criminal, someone passing through town who saw an opportunity for violence without consequence. More extreme theories suggested a disturbed individual acting on impulse or compulsion, someone with detailed knowledge of the household and its routines. Each theory attempted to explain the shocking brutality and precision of the attacks, yet no single explanation was confirmed. Public fascination and media coverage further fueled speculation. Newspapers and later historians debated the merits of various theories, and amateur sleuths offered their own interpretations. From modern forensic analyses to historical retrospectives, each attempt to solve the mystery has underscored the difficulty of the case. The murders occurred in a time with limited investigative tools, and the killer left virtually no trace. The unanswered questions extend beyond identity. How did the murderer enter the Moore home unnoticed? Why target the entire family, including visiting children? Was this a carefully planned act, or a crime of opportunity that escalated uncontrollably? The absence of clear motives, coupled with the lack of witnesses, has left these questions open to interpretation, making the case as compelling today as it was in 1912. Advances in forensic technology have offered new avenues for investigation, including DNA analysis of preserved evidence and examination of historical crime scene reports. Yet, even with modern tools, the case remains unsolved, a haunting reminder that some mysteries resist resolution. The Villisca Axe murders continue to captivate the public imagination, not only for their brutality, but for the enduring uncertainty surrounding them. Ultimately, the case is defined by what is unknown. The killer's identity, motives, and fate remain mysteries. This unresolved nature has preserved the story of the Moore family in collective memory, ensuring that the tragedy is never forgotten and that the town of Villisca remains forever linked to one of the darkest chapters in American crime history. As we reach the final chapter of the Villisca Axe murders, it is important to reflect on the lives lost, the enduring mystery, and the lessons this tragedy leaves behind. The Moore family and the two visiting girls were ordinary people, living ordinary lives in a quiet town, yet their lives were cut short in a way that remains shocking more than a century later. Each victim had hopes, dreams, and a place in the hearts of those who loved them. Josiah and Sarah Moore were pillars of their community, providing stability and care to their children and contributing to the town's life. The children, full of innocence and vitality, represented the promise of youth. Ina and Lena Stillinger were friends welcomed into the home, unaware that a night of laughter and shared stories would turn into the darkest of memories. Remembering these lives is essential, not only to honor them but to grasp the full human cost behind the headlines and historical accounts. The murders also serve as a stark reminder of vulnerability, even in places that seem safe. Villisca, like many small towns, relied on trust and close community ties. That very trust was exploited, leaving an indelible scar on both the town and its residents. The story of the Moore family is a cautionary tale, Tragedy can strike even where comfort and familiarity exist, and the consequences can ripple through generations. From an investigative perspective, the case highlights both the limitations and progress of forensic science. In 1912, tools were scarce, evidence was fragile, and investigative techniques were in their infancy. Today, historical cases like Villisca are examined with modern forensic methods, including DNA analysis and careful review of historical records. Yet the case remains unresolved. The endurance of this mystery demonstrates both the challenges of criminal investigation and the importance of preserving evidence and memories, no matter how much time has passed. The town of Villisca itself continues to carry the legacy of that June night. Residents remember the tragedy through memorials, storytelling, and education, ensuring that the victims' lives are not forgotten. The Moore family's story is woven into the identity of the community, a reminder of loss, resilience, and the pursuit of understanding. Ultimately, the Villisca Axe murders endure in collective memory because of the combination of human tragedy, unresolved mystery, and the universal questions it raises about safety, trust, and justice. The case compels us to reflect not only on crime but also on empathy, vigilance, and the fragility of life. As we leave the quiet streets of 1912 Villisca behind, we carry with us the memory of Josiah and Sarah Moore, their children, and the visiting girls whose lives were taken too soon. Their story is a reminder that even in the calmest towns, shadows can fall, and that remembering, reflecting, and learning from the past is one way to honor lives lost. Though the killer was never found, the legacy of the Moore family remains, in history, in the hearts of those who study and tell their story, and in the enduring question of how such darkness can touch even the most ordinary of lives. Story 3. Picture a remote farmstead in rural Germany, nestled between snow-covered fields and dense forests. The year is 1922, and the Hinterkaifeck farm lies isolated, several hundred meters from the nearest neighbors. Life here is simple, quiet, and, for the inhabitants, routine until one spring, a series of events would shatter that calm forever. Tonight, we delve into the chilling story of the Hinterkaifeck murders, a case so mysterious and brutal that it continues to haunt true crime enthusiasts and historians nearly a century later. 6 people were murdered in their home under circumstances that remain puzzling, and the killer's identity was never definitively established. This story is more than a crime. It is a glimpse into human isolation, suspicion, and terror in a time and place far removed from modern civilization. Before we step onto the farm, if you enjoy carefully narrated true crime stories designed for sleep, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. Each tale brings history, suspense, and real-life mysteries, crafted to hold your attention while keeping the narration calm and immersive. The story begins with the Gruber family who managed the Hinterkaifeck farm. Andreas Gruber, a man in his 70s, lived there with his wife Kazilia, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, Victoria's children, Kazilia, 16, and Joseph, 7, and the maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had been newly hired. The family was well known locally, their lives ordinary and governed by the rhythm of farm work. In the days leading up to the murders, neighbors and locals noticed strange occurrences. Footprints appeared in the snow leading to the house, but none led away. Strange noises were reported at night, and members of the family mentioned feeling watched. Some even spoke of seeing a shadowy figure near the farm, though these reports were not taken seriously at the time. Then came the morning of March 31st, 1922, when the household failed to appear at church and neighbors realized something was amiss. The quiet of the farm, once routine and comforting, had transformed into a place of fear and mystery. When authorities finally investigated, they found a scene so horrific that it defied imagination. The entire family and the maid had been brutally murdered with a pickaxe, their bodies hidden within the house, yet the killer had left no clear traces of escape. What made the Hinterkaifeck murders particularly terrifying was the sense that the victims had lived alongside the killer for days. Some evidence suggested that the perpetrator stayed in the house after the killings, feeding animals and tending to the property. The fact that no one saw or apprehended the killer has baffled investigators and fueled theories for generations. In the sections that follow, we will explore the family's life, the chilling signs before the murders, the discovery of the crime, the investigation, suspects, and enduring mysteries. Each part of this story brings us closer to understanding both the horror and the enduring fascination of Hinterkaifeck. Stay with me as we step onto the remote farm, into the lives of the Gruber family, and into one of Germany's most infamous unsolved murders. To truly understand the horror of the Hinterkaifeck murders, we must first meet the family at the center of this tragedy. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, was a man in his 70s, known locally for his hardworking nature and quiet demeanor. He managed the farm with diligence, ensuring the animals were fed and the fields maintained. His wife, Cecilia Gruber, slightly younger, shared his dedication to the farm and family, providing care and guidance in the household. Together, they represented stability and resilience in a harsh, isolated rural environment. The couple's widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, lived on the farm with her 2 children, Cecilia, aged 16, and Joseph, aged 7. Victoria managed the household and helped with farm duties, balancing work and care for her children. Young Cecilia and Joseph were typical children of the era, active, curious, and unaware of the danger looming nearby. They were raised with close ties to the land, learning early the routines of rural life, from tending animals to helping with chores. Adding to the household was the maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had been recently employed to assist Victoria with domestic tasks. Maria, like the rest of the household, played a role in maintaining the rhythm of the farm. Her presence was meant to ease the workload and support the family, yet she, too, would become a victim of the mysterious violence that struck the farm. In the days before the murders, unusual events began to unsettle the family. Neighbors later recalled that the Grubers had mentioned hearing strange noises in the attic, footsteps in the snow that led to the house but did not return, and an uneasy feeling that someone was watching the property. These small details, seemingly minor at the time, now suggest that the family may have sensed a looming threat, yet they remained isolated and vulnerable, with no nearby neighbors close enough to intervene. The Gruber family and Maria Baumgartner lived lives shaped by the routines of rural Germany in the early 20th century. Their days were filled with chores, tending livestock, and caring for the home. Evenings were often quiet, spent with meals and family conversation, the only interruptions being the occasional visitor or passing neighbor. This ordinary existence makes the murders all the more shocking, a violent intrusion into lives marked by predictability and trust. Understanding the family is key to appreciating the depth of the tragedy. These were real people with personalities, dreams, and relationships, not simply names in a historical record. Their familiarity with each other and the land, their daily routines, and their openness to life on a secluded farm all contributed to their vulnerability. The fact that someone could enter this household and commit such brutality, possibly while the family was aware of their presence, underscores the terror and mystery of Hinterkaifeck. The night of March 31st, 1922, began like any other at the Hinterkaifeck farm. The family followed their usual routines, finishing chores, preparing meals, and tending to the animals. Andreas and Cecilia Gruber likely checked the barn and the surrounding property, while Victoria and the children wrapped up the day's tasks inside the house. The maid, Maria Baumgartner, had settled into her room, unaware that danger was approaching. In the days leading up to the murders, the family had reported strange occurrences. Footsteps were heard in the snow outside, but no one was seen entering or leaving. Objects in the house appeared moved, and the family spoke of an uneasy feeling of being watched. Some researchers believe the killer may have entered the home in advance, possibly lingering in the attic or other hidden spaces, observing the family while remaining undetected. That night, a violent presence moved through the farm. Using a pickaxe, the intruder attacked Andreas and Cecilia Gruber, Victoria Gabriel, her children Cecilia and Joseph, and the maid, Maria. Each strike was fatal. Evidence suggests the murders were carried out with chilling precision, and that the victims were likely unable to defend themselves. The isolated nature of the farm ensured that no neighbors would hear the attack or come to their aid. When the family failed to appear the next morning, neighbors grew concerned. It was unusual for the Grubers not to tend to the farm or appear in the village. Eventually, local residents approached the property and discovered a scene that would become infamous in criminal history. Inside the house, the bodies of the 6 family members and the maid were found, each brutally murdered. The pickaxe used in the killings was still at the scene, a silent witness to the violence that had occurred. Authorities arrived and began a careful examination. The scene was chaotic yet precise. The placement of the bodies, the untouched valuables, and the absence of forced entry suggested a perpetrator who was familiar with the household. Investigators were perplexed by signs that the killer may have stayed in the home after committing the murders, tending animals, feeding livestock, and seemingly living among the victim's possessions before disappearing. The discovery of the murders sent shockwaves through the small Bavarian community. Villagers, previously accustomed to the quiet rhythms of rural life, now faced the horrifying reality that a brutal, unknown killer had struck close to home. Fear and suspicion spread rapidly, and the farm became a focal point for neighbors, local authorities, and later, the media. The Hinterkaifeck murders are terrifying not only for their brutality but for the lingering mystery. The idea that someone could move unseen among the family, commit the killings, and leave no immediate trace captured the imagination of investigators and the public alike. The questions raised that night about motive, method, and the killer's identity remain unanswered, forming the enduring enigma of Hinterkaifeck.